This photograph was taken in 1882. A normal family standing in front of their farmhouse. Nothing unusual, until modern technology allowed historians to zoom in closer than anyone ever had before. What they discovered hiding in the shadows behind the family shocked everyone who studied the image. And the most disturbing part, every time the photo is scanned again, the figure inside it appears closer. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some experts refuse to look at it anymore. In the winter of 2022, historian Daniel Carter arrived at the Small Ridgeway Historical Museum, a quiet brick building sitting at the edge of a sleepy rural town. Snow covered the streets outside, and the museum itself rarely received visitors during that time of year. Most days, the only sounds inside were the soft hum of the heating system and the faint creak of old wooden floors. Daniel had been hired to help catalog a collection of newly donated artifacts. The items came from a farmhouse that had recently been abandoned and scheduled for demolition. The owners had lived there for generations, but the last resident passed away without any close relatives. When workers cleaned out the attic, they discovered several dusty boxes filled with old photographs, journals, and household items. Most people would have considered the collection ordinary. But for historians like Daniel, even ordinary objects could hide forgotten stories. On his third day working in the museum archive room, Daniel opened the final box from the farmhouse. It was old and fragile, its cardboard corners worn thin with age. A thin layer of dust covered the lid. He carefully lifted it open. Inside were dozens of photographs stacked together, tied with a faded cloth ribbon. The photos were typical of the late 1800s. Black and white, stiff poses, serious expressions. Back then, people rarely smiled for photographs because the cameras required long exposure times. Everyone had to stay perfectly still. Daniel spent hours scanning them one by one. A farmer standing beside a horse. Two sisters sitting on a wooden fence. A group of workers outside what looked like a lumber mill. Nothing unusual. Nothing mysterious. Just quiet moments from lives that had ended more than a century ago. Late in the afternoon, as pale winter light faded through the archive window, Daniel reached the bottom of the stack. That was when he found the photograph. It was slightly larger than the others and mounted on thick, dark cardboard. The edges were worn, and the surface had faint cracks from age. Written on the back in delicate handwriting were the words, "The Whittaker family, spring 1882. Daniel turned the photograph over. 5 people stood in front of a wooden farmhouse. The father stood on the left side of the image. He wore a dark coat and a wide hat, his face serious and lined from years of hard work. His hands rested stiffly at his sides. Next to him stood the mother, dressed in a long, plain dress with her hair neatly tied back. Her posture was straight, but something about her expression felt tense. In front of them were 3 children, 2 girls and a young boy. The girls looked older, maybe around 10 or 12 years old. Their dresses were simple, their hair carefully braided. The boy stood between them. He looked younger than the others, perhaps 6 or 7. Daniel studied the image for a moment. At first glance, it seemed like a completely normal family portrait from the 19th century. But the longer he looked, the more uneasy he began to feel. Something about the photograph felt strange. The family didn't look relaxed. In fact, they looked frightened. The father's eyes were slightly wider than normal. The mother's lips were pressed tightly together. But the most disturbing detail was the youngest child. The little boy's expression looked wrong. His eyes were wide open, and his shoulders were stiff. His mouth was slightly parted, as if he had been about to say something, or scream. Daniel leaned closer to the photo. He noticed that none of the family members were smiling. That alone wasn't unusual for photographs of that time. But their faces didn't look calm either. They looked tense, almost frozen in fear. Daniel glanced at the background of the photograph. Behind the family stood the farmhouse itself. The building looked old even for that time period, with rough wooden boards and a large barn standing a short distance behind it. The barn door was partially open. The inside looked completely dark. Daniel felt a strange chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain why. It was just a photograph, a simple family portrait from more than 140 years ago. Still, something about the image made him uncomfortable. The atmosphere in the room suddenly felt colder. Daniel shook his head and chuckled softly to himself. He had spent too many hours alone in the archive room. His imagination was probably just getting the better of him. He placed the photograph carefully on the scanner. The museum had strict rules for preserving old materials, so every image had to be digitized and stored in the museum database. Daniel adjusted the scanner lid and clicked the scan button. The machine hummed quietly as the light slowly moved across the photograph. A few seconds later, the digital image appeared on his computer screen. At first, it looked exactly the same, but digital scans allowed much closer inspection than the human eye. Daniel leaned forward slightly. He zoomed in on the family's faces. The details became sharper, more defined. The expressions looked even more uncomfortable now. The little boy's face, in particular, seemed almost terrified. Daniel frowned. "Why would a child look that scared in a family photo?" he murmured quietly. Then something strange caught his attention. Near the barn door behind the family, there was something in the image that he hadn't noticed before. At first it looked like nothing more than a dark smudge. A shadow, maybe. But as Daniel zoomed in closer, the shape began to look less like a shadow and more like something standing there. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. His eyes slowly widened because the dark shape behind the barn door looked like a person. Daniel stared at the computer screen, leaning closer without even realizing it. The quiet archive room felt suddenly smaller, the silence heavier. On the monitor, the old photograph from 1882 filled the screen. The Whittaker family stood frozen in time, exactly as they had more than a century ago. Their stiff posture and serious faces were now clearer than ever thanks to the high-resolution scan. But Daniel wasn't looking at them anymore. His eyes were locked on the area near the barn. At first, he thought it might just be a shadow caused by poor lighting. Old cameras often created strange dark shapes, especially in areas that didn't receive enough sunlight. Still, something about this shape felt different. Daniel slowly moved the mouse and zoomed in further. The image enlarged. Pixels sharpened. The dark smudge near the barn door began to take a clearer form. Daniel felt his chest tighten. It looked like a figure. Not a blur, not a stain. A figure. Someone was standing just inside the barn doorway. The shape appeared thin and unusually tall. Most of its body was hidden by the darkness inside the barn, but its head and shoulders were visible enough to recognize. Daniel squinted at the screen. Maybe it's just another family member, he muttered quietly. But something didn't make sense. If someone else had been there during the photograph, why would they stand in the shadows instead of with the family? And why didn't Daniel notice them the first time? He looked at the photo. He zoomed in again. Now the image filled nearly the entire screen with the barn entrance. The figure's head slowly came into focus. Daniel suddenly felt a cold shiver crawl across his arms. The figure had a face, but the face looked wrong. The skin appeared extremely pale, almost white against the dark background. The head was slightly tilted to one side, like someone watching from an awkward angle. Two dark shapes marked the position of its eyes. Deep, hollow, They were not looking at the family. They were looking directly at the camera. Daniel instinctively leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen, unsure of what he was seeing. "Okay, calm down," he whispered to himself. Old photographs could easily create illusions. Lighting problems, film damage, dust on the lens, all kinds of things could create shapes that looked like faces. He had seen similar things before, but never something this clear. Daniel rubbed his eyes and leaned forward again. He zoomed out slightly so the whole family was visible again. Then, he noticed something that made his stomach sink. None of the family members were looking at the camera. They were all looking somewhere else. Slowly, Daniel moved his cursor and followed the direction of their eyes. The father's gaze, the mother's tense stare, the frightened eyes of the children. All of them were pointed in the same direction, toward the barn door, toward the shadow figure. Daniel felt his heart begin to beat faster. That wasn't normal. In 1882, photographs required people to stay perfectly still for several seconds. The photographer would usually instruct everyone exactly where to look. Most family portraits from that era show people staring straight at the camera. But the Whittaker family wasn't. They were staring behind them, at something standing in the barn. Daniel looked again at the youngest boy. Now that the image was clearer, the child's expression seemed even more disturbing. His eyes were wide with panic. His mouth was slightly open, not like someone smiling, like someone trying not to scream. Daniel slowly zoomed closer to the boy's face. The fear in the child's eyes looked painfully real. It didn't look staged. It didn't look like acting. It looked like a child who had just seen something terrifying. Daniel swallowed nervously. Maybe the photographer caught someone walking into the barn, he said quietly. But even as he said it, the explanation didn't feel right. If someone had simply walked by, the family wouldn't look so frightened. And the person in the barn wouldn't be standing perfectly still like that. Daniel zoomed back toward the figure again. The pale face became clearer. The head remained tilted slightly sideways. The eyes were dark and hollow, like empty holes staring outward. The longer Daniel looked, the more uneasy he felt. Something about the figure's posture seemed unnatural. Its shoulders were slumped strangely, almost like its arms were hanging too low. But the darkness inside the barn hid most of its body. Daniel adjusted the brightness and contrast settings on the image. The screen flickered slightly as the software processed the changes. The darkness inside the barn lightened just a little. Daniel leaned closer. The shape became slightly clearer, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The figure wasn't standing straight. It looked like it was leaning forward, like it was slowly stepping out of the barn. Daniel's hand froze on the mouse. His mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe a farm worker, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone who accidentally walked into the photograph. But if that were true, why was everyone in the picture staring at it like that? And why did the little boy look like he was about to cry? Daniel sat back in his chair, suddenly aware of how quiet the museum had become. Outside, the winter sun had already begun to set. The archive room was dim now, lit only by the pale glow of the computer monitor. The old photograph remained on the screen. The Whittaker family stood frozen forever in front of their farmhouse. And behind them, inside the dark barn doorway, the pale figure continued staring directly into the camera, as if it had known someone would eventually look closely enough to see it. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he whispered something he didn't expect to say. "I don't think that's a shadow." Daniel didn't sleep much that night. The image of the pale figure in the barn doorway kept returning to his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, He saw the same tilted head and those hollow, dark eyes staring directly into the camera. By morning, he had convinced himself there had to be a logical explanation. Old photographs could easily be misleading. The human brain often tried to find patterns, especially faces, even when they weren't really there. Still, the image felt too clear to ignore, so Daniel decided to do what any careful historian would do. He sent the photograph to experts. First, he emailed a digital copy to a photography restoration specialist who worked with historical archives. Then he contacted a professor who studied early camera technology. Finally, he sent the image to a forensic imaging analyst who sometimes helped museums analyze damaged photographs. Within hours, replies began arriving. The first message came from the restoration specialist. Interesting photograph. I examined the scan carefully. I do not see any signs of double exposure or light distortion. The shape near the barn appears to be part of the original image. Daniel frowned as he read it. That meant the figure wasn't caused by a camera error. A few hours later, the second expert replied, the camera used for photographs in the 1880s required long exposure times. Moving objects usually appear blurred. The figure you pointed out has sharp edges and clear contrast. That suggests it was standing still during the exposure. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Standing still. Whoever, or whatever, was in the barn had been standing there long enough to appear clearly in the photograph. The third message arrived that evening. The forensic imaging analyst had enhanced the photograph and studied its shadows and lighting. His conclusion was short and direct. The figure is physically present in the scene. It is casting a faint shadow on the barn wall behind it. Daniel stared at the message for a long time. If the experts were correct, then the figure in the photograph wasn't a trick of the camera. It was actually there when the picture was taken. But that only created a bigger question. Who was it? Daniel returned to the photograph and studied the farmhouse in the background. The building looked familiar somehow, but he couldn't immediately place it. Then he remembered something. The donation records for the box of photographs. The box had come from the attic of the farmhouse that was recently scheduled for demolition. Daniel pulled up the museum's acquisition files and searched for the address. It didn't take long to find it. The property had once belonged to a family named Whitaker. Daniel felt a small chill run through him. That matched the name written on the back of the photograph. He decided to dig deeper into the local history records. The town library kept digital archives of old newspapers and census documents. Within minutes, Daniel began finding information about the Whitaker family. The father's name was Thomas Whitaker. His wife was Eliza Whitaker. They had 3 children, Sarah, Mary, and a young boy named Caleb. According to property records, the Whitakers owned the farmhouse for several years in the early 1880s. Then Daniel found a newspaper article dated October 1882. The headline immediately caught his attention. Local farm famile Missessingi. Daniel opened the article. His eyes moved quickly across the faded text. The Whitaker family had disappeared suddenly. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the farmhouse late one night. Shouting, crying, and what one witness described as terrible screaming. At first, no one investigated. Farmhouses were spread far apart in those days. People often kept to themselves. But after several days passed with no sign of the Whitakers, a neighbor finally went to check on them. What he found disturbed the entire town. The house was empty. No one was inside. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken furniture. No blood. It looked as if the family had simply vanished. But there were strange details mentioned in the report. The back door of the house was wide open, and the barn door had been left open as well. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked again at the photograph on his computer screen. In the picture, the barn door was partially open. Exactly like the newspaper described. He continued reading the article. Search parties were organized, but they found nothing. No bodies. No tracks leading away from the property. The Whittaker family was never seen again. The case eventually faded into local legend, but the final paragraph of the article mentioned something unsettling. When neighbors entered the barn during the search, they found strange scratch marks covering the inside wooden walls. Long, deep scratches that looked like they had been carved into the wood by something sharp. But no tools were found. Daniel felt his throat tighten. His eyes slowly moved back to the photograph. The family stood frozen in front of the farmhouse. The father looked tense. The mother looked afraid. And the youngest boy looked absolutely terrified. Behind them, the barn door stood open. And inside the dark doorway, the pale figure watched silently from the shadows. Daniel whispered quietly to himself. What were they looking at? The room suddenly felt colder. Outside the museum windows, the evening sky had turned dark. Daniel stared at the photograph again. The more he studied the image, the more it felt like the moment captured in the picture wasn't just a normal family portrait. It looked like something else. Like the photograph had captured the exact moment before something terrible happened. And the longer Daniel stared at the pale figure in the barn, the more it seemed like the thing in the shadows had been there for only one reason: watching the family, waiting for something to begin. For several days, Daniel tried to focus on other work. The museum archive held thousands of historical items waiting to be cataloged. Letters, tools, maps, and hundreds of old photographs filled the storage shelves. Normally, Daniel enjoyed studying each object and uncovering small pieces of forgotten history. But his mind kept drifting back to the Whittaker photograph. Every time he sat at his desk, the image returned to him: the tense family, the open barn door, and the pale figure standing inside the darkness. He had already confirmed that the Whittaker family had disappeared in 1882. He had also learned that the farmhouse where the photograph was found was scheduled to be demolished in just a few weeks. Part of Daniel wanted to visit the property before it was gone forever. But another part of him wasn't sure he wanted to go anywhere near it. Late one evening, when most of the museum staff had already gone home, Daniel finally opened the photograph again. The archive room was quiet, illuminated only by the pale glow of his computer screen and a small desk lamp. The scanned image appeared on the monitor. The Whittaker family stood frozen exactly as before. Daniel studied the photo again, slowly zooming across each part of the image. The father's face, the mother's tight expression, the frightened children. Finally, he moved the cursor toward the barn. The pale figure appeared again, standing in the dark doorway. Even after several days, the sight of it still made Daniel uneasy. He adjusted the image brightness slightly. Then he zoomed in closer. The face of the figure became clearer. Its head remained tilted at the same unnatural angle. The skin looked almost colorless against the black background of the barn. But something about the figure bothered Daniel now, more than before. He couldn't immediately explain why. So he zoomed in further. The image grew larger, and that was when he noticed something strange. The figure's arms. At first, Daniel thought the dark shapes hanging below the shoulders were simply shadows. But when he increased the contrast and sharpened the image, the shapes became clearer. They weren't shadows. They were arms. Very long arms. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. The arms hung down from the figure's shoulders in an unnatural way. They looked far too long for a human body. The hands extended nearly to the figure's knees. Daniel stared at the screen, feeling a slow chill spread through his chest. "That can't be right," he murmured. He zoomed in again. Now he could clearly see the hands. The fingers were thin and stretched out, longer than normal human fingers. They looked almost skeletal, barely visible against the darkness of the barn. But that wasn't the worst part. The figure wasn't standing straight. Its posture looked strange, almost like it was leaning forward. Daniel adjusted the brightness again. The dark interior of the barn slowly became a little lighter. More details appeared inside the doorway. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The figure wasn't standing in the doorway. It was emerging from inside the barn. Its upper body leaned forward slightly, as if it had just stepped, or crawled, out of the darkness. But the darkness behind it looked wrong. Old barns were usually dim inside, but this darkness was different. It looked deeper, thicker, almost like the light simply disappeared once it passed the doorway. Daniel stared at the black space behind the figure. The longer he looked, the more uncomfortable he felt. The darkness didn't look like the inside of a building. It looked like a hole. A deep, endless void where no light could reach. Daniel rubbed his forehead and took a slow breath. "You're imagining things," he told himself quietly. Still, he couldn't stop staring. Something about the barn interior continued to bother him. He zoomed in one more time. The image became extremely close now, almost grainy with enlarged detail. At first, he saw nothing but the pale figure and the dark background. Then something shifted in his vision. A faint shape appeared behind the figure. Daniel leaned forward slowly. Then another shape, and another. His eyes widened. There were shapes in the darkness. Not just one, many. Faint pale forms barely visible against the black background. Daniel adjusted the contrast again. The shapes became clearer, and suddenly he realized what he was looking at. Faces. There were faces inside the darkness. Dozens of them. Some were only faint outlines, while others were clearer. Pale shapes with hollow eyes stared outward from the black void behind the figure. They weren't looking at the family. They were looking toward the camera. Daniel felt his heart begin pounding hard in his chest. "That's impossible," he whispered. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned closer to the screen. The faces were different shapes and sizes. Some looked older, some looked younger, but all of them appeared trapped inside the darkness behind the figure, watching, silent, still. Daniel suddenly pushed his chair back from the desk. His heart was racing now. Every instinct told him something about the photograph was deeply wrong. The barn didn't look like a barn anymore. It looked like something else entirely. Like the doorway was opening into somewhere that should not exist. And the pale figure standing at the entrance. It no longer looked like someone hiding in the shadows. It looked like something coming out of them. Daniel quickly closed the image on his computer. The screen went dark. For a moment, he sat in silence, listening to his own breathing. The quiet museum suddenly felt colder than before. His eyes slowly moved toward the dark windows of the archive room. Outside, the night had completely fallen. For the first time since he found the photograph, Daniel felt a deep sense of dread settle into his mind, because one thought refused to leave him. If the figure in the photograph was coming out of the barn, then what exactly had been inside it all along? After Daniel discovered the faces hidden in the darkness of the barn, he avoided looking at the photograph for several days. He told himself he needed time to think clearly. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was afraid to look at it again. The image had begun to feel less like an old historical photograph and more like something alive, something watching back. Still, Daniel couldn't ignore it forever. The Whittaker disappearance was already strange enough. Now the photograph seemed to show something far more disturbing than a simple family portrait. So Daniel decided to share the image with a small group of researchers who specialized in analyzing historical photographs and digital artifacts. Within a few days, several experts were studying the scan. Some believed the faces in the darkness were simply patterns created by damaged film. Others weren't so sure. One analyst carefully enhanced the entire photograph using modern software designed to clarify facial details. When the results arrived, Daniel opened the file slowly. The enhanced image looked sharper than ever before. Every wrinkle on the father's coat, every braid in the girl's hair, every board in the farmhouse wall was clearly visible. But the part that caught the researchers' attention wasn't the barn this time. It was the mother. One of the analysts had noticed something strange about her face. At first glance, she looked calm, just another serious expression typical of the 1800s. But when the image was zoomed in closely, her mouth appeared slightly open, not smiling, not frowning, just barely parted. The analyst believed she might have been speaking at the exact moment the photograph was taken. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. If she had been speaking, what was she saying? The researcher ran a special program that studied the shape of her lips. The software could estimate possible words based on common mouth movements. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but sometimes it could provide clues. The program finished processing. 2 possible words appeared on the screen. Daniel read them silently. Then his stomach dropped. The words were, "Don't move." He stared at the screen for a long time. Why would a mother say that during a family photograph? Then the answer slowly formed in his mind. Maybe she wasn't speaking to the photographer. Maybe she was speaking to her children. Daniel opened the photograph again and examined the family. Now that he looked carefully, the scene began to feel different. The father's posture wasn't relaxed. His shoulders were tense. The girls looked stiff with fear. And the youngest boy looked like he was on the edge of panic. It didn't look like a normal family portrait anymore. It looked like a moment where everyone was trying not to move. As if they were afraid that movement might cause something terrible to happen. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. Slowly, he turned his attention back to the barn. The pale figure remained there, half hidden in the doorway. But another researcher had noticed something else. Something even more disturbing. The direction of the figure's gaze. At first, everyone assumed it was staring at the family. But when analysts studied the angle of its eyes carefully, they realized something unsettling. The figure wasn't looking at the Whittaker family. It was looking past them, toward the front of the photograph, toward the camera, toward the person taking the picture. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Whoever took that photograph had been standing only a few feet away from the family. That meant the figure in the barn was staring directly at them, watching them. Daniel quickly searched the historical records again. He looked for any mention of the photographer who captured the Whittaker portrait. Most photographs from that time were taken by traveling photographers who moved from town to town. Eventually, Daniel found a small reference in an old local newspaper. A photographer named Edwin Mallory had been working in the area during the spring of 1882. Mallory had visited several farms offering family portraits. The Whittakers had been one of his clients. But something strange appeared in the records. After the Whittaker family disappeared, so did Edwin Mallory. He was never seen again. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. The photograph suddenly felt heavier than before. It wasn't just a picture of the Whittaker family anymore. It was the last known moment anyone had seen them alive, and possibly the last photograph Edwin Mallory ever took. The museum eventually decided to lock the original photograph away in a climate-controlled archive. Only digital copies were allowed for study. But over time, researchers began noticing something deeply unsettling. Every time the photograph was scanned with newer equipment, tiny details seemed slightly different. At first, people assumed it was just improved resolution. Better cameras revealed more information in the image, but one researcher noticed something that made several experts uneasy. The position of the pale figure in the barn seemed closer. In earlier scans, the figure stood deeper inside the doorway. In newer scans, it appeared slightly farther forward, almost as if it had taken a step. Daniel didn't want to believe it. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He opened the newest scan taken just the year before. His eyes slowly moved across the image. The father, the mother, the frightened children. Then he reached the barn. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. The figure was no longer standing behind the barn door. It had moved. Now it stood directly behind the youngest boy. Its long arm stretched forward. One thin hand rested gently on the child's shoulder. The boy's terrified expression suddenly made perfect sense. He hadn't been looking at the barn. He had been feeling something standing right behind him. Daniel stared at the screen in complete silence. Then he noticed one final detail. The pale figure was no longer looking toward the camera. Its hollow eyes were now staring directly outward, as if it wasn't watching the past anymore. As if it was now looking at whoever was studying the photograph. And Daniel suddenly realized something that made his heart pound with fear. Every time someone looks closely at the image, the thing inside it gets a little closer, waiting for the next person who decides to zoom in.